We're entering a new era. We're underestimating our adversary somewhere in a mountain 500 meters below ground. How are you going to solve that problem? There's only one tool left in my toolbox, and I got to use it. You have to think of the domino effects, the hurricane that you're going to unleash in terms of a counterstrike. And it's extremely alarming because once you open Pandora's box, you ain't never going to be able to close it. We're rushing into a situation where we don't know what the other party has. North Korea, for example, they have these elaborate public works projects. So you can imagine the amount of underground fortifications that they have. Russia, using some of the salt mine tunnels in Siberia, have been storing enormous amount of raw materials for the war effort. The only countries that are not taking this very seriously, unfortunately, is the West. Take all this as a picture and you cannot not be concerned. Could basically lead to the apocalypse. I mean, it's not an exaggeration. Subterranean warfare seems to be one of the preferred methods of warfare. In China, they consider it as part of their future strategy. 5,000, 6,000 kilometers of these things that are being built. And I wish we would start building a lot more elaborate fortifications for every single citizen.
I mean, if anything were to pique people's interest in making these kind of preparations and to make you confident that this is a legitimate threat that governments are taking seriously, it's a seed vault located far in the north that nobody has access to unless you got a big government plane, that is being used to store all the world's food DNA in case of a global cataclysm. I mean, if anybody ever called a prepper crazy, I just say make reference to the seed vault. But I also think that that's probably not the only seed vault. I mean, we know that the Russians have one.
Exactly.
And what are your thoughts on that? Just in general, and do you think that there are other seed vaults in other countries besides the one in Russia that we know about?
The answer is absolutely yes. There are other facilities in other countries. And I can tell you one thing, because you just mentioned Russia. When the Chernobyl event happened, and the experts recommended to build a lead sarcophagus for the Chernobyl reactor, when they did the mathematical calculation of the amount of lead required, it was enormous. Yet somehow Russia found that lead. Here's a question: where did that come from? It turned out that Russia have, since Peter the Great, using some of the salt mine tunnels in Siberia, have been storing enormous amount of raw materials for the war effort. So I was shocked. They're storing copper, lead, steel, food, grains, you name it, they've been storing. And I know this for a fact because I came across these documents when I was doing my research. I tried to find it again online and I couldn't locate it, but it's there. It's definitely there. So these guys were not just storing food and seeds. They were storing things that we could not even imagine in these just enormous caverns underground. And China is the same thing. I mean, China, it's such a difference between reading Chinese and Eastern military books and Western military books, because you will see that the Eastern military leadership is obsessed with food logistics in terms of the bushels of rice or bushels of grain or whatever. Their entire campaigns were almost planned right around that. And that's why one of the reasons why Sichuan in China was one of the regions that everybody was trying to fight and contest, because it's farmland. And they measured the size of the army by two things: the number of generals they had. They didn't care about the soldier because they figured they could cut and paste those. So that's their way of thinking. And about how much agriculture output do you have. And the punishment during the Cao Cao era for anybody taking their cart on a rice field was execution. Because food was such a priority, so that you had to basically just focus on food production. And I'll tell you, the food saving culture exists even in Europe. These properties that I mentioned, I visited in Europe. You visit any castle, you visit any old farmhouse. These things have been around for 800, 900 years, 1,000 years, still standing, built very strong, not from drywall. And what will shock you is that they all have wine cellars and root cellars, right? And these things are able to keep I mean, wine, obviously, I mean, I've been to some wine cellars that are just mind-boggling in terms of size. I just never thought they could get this big, but they are. And so it was part of the culture in Europe to preserve 1 or 2 years worth of food for you and for you to be able to produce and survive. So it's unfortunately in the West, it doesn't get enough exposure how other countries in the world look at prepping and stocking up and the strategic reserves. Countries have strategic. I know in the US we have strategic reserve for certain things.
For pretty much everything that's vital. We got medication, we have fuel, oil, ammo, anything a prepper would want, the government, and I've made the video on this comparison before, that you should have your own strategic reserve because the government has strategic reserves. Maybe not enough here in the United States. They actually scrap the grain reserve because they feel as though we're a net exporter. But yes, like you're saying, in many importing countries, even ones that maybe aren't, it's still embedded in the culture there.
It's funny you use that term, be your own strategic reserves. I mean, I forget it was Gerald Celente or who that says be your own Federal Reserve Bank, right? I forgot who, but I think it was Gerald Celente probably, or it was Lynette Zhang. I'm not sure, but one of the two. Well, and I love that term, be your own central banker. And I think that encapsulates that statement about having your own strategic reserve, really encapsulates all prepping, because think about the peace of mind you would have if you're sitting in your home and you know you and your family have a year worth of every single thing you could possibly need stocked up somewhere. Just think about how relaxing that is. I mean, it's like God forbid you get in a car accident, you're like, you know what? I have the best car insurance. Nobody's hurt, but I have the best car insurance, so we could fix the cars, no problems, right? And that brings us back to the world, leave the world behind in terms of the movie. That medicine, saving some medication, saving some. I mean, just the list is endless. But honest to God, it's not that difficult to do if you make the intellectual decision to cross that chasm from awareness to preparedness. That's really the toughest part, is crossing that intellectual chasm of just awareness to I'm going to do something about it, right? But I think nowadays it's sort of a priority, because if people are aware that prices of things are going to go up, it's just wise to try to get as much of it as possible. And mind you, in terms of conflict, and we're talking about subterranean warfare, if you look right now at the impact that these wars in the Middle East could have on the supply chain, if the Red Sea is shut down, and I could tell you one thing, if you really want to get really shocked, go to Google Earth and just look at the terrain surrounding Bab el Mandab, or the Gate of Tears, as it's called. And you'll see just a chain of mountains that's just endless. You could hide anything in there and nobody's going to find it, right? And now with the asymmetric technology, with drone technology, $2,000 drone versus $1 million missile, it's just economically not feasible. You look at Iran, for example. Most people don't realize West and Southern Iran the Zagros Mountains are some of the most dense, high, wide ranges of mountains in the world. These are all asymmetric assets that I wish everybody will just kiss and make up. Let's put it this way, because I personally can't see a scenario where anybody walks away a winner in a global conflict. It's just not possible. And while I'm saying that and hoping for it, the preparations are there. You look at Russia limiting the export of its grains except to its allies. You look at India limiting the export of rice. You look at China. Look at North Korea. You had an episode about North Korea. North Korea saying you have to be ready, and the list goes on and on. And I could tell you from my travels, the price of food have gone up significantly across the world. And maybe not in terms of the price per brand, but in terms of the shrinkflation, where everything is smaller, but the price is higher. And you're seeing this pretty much everywhere. And when you travel and you talk to people, and when I travel, I love to talk to concierges in the hotels. I love to talk to cab drivers, barbers, because they give you a lot of real life information. This is what real people, I mean, they're not the elites. These are the real people, the salt of the earth. And when you listen to them, everybody is telling you how food prices are going up, medicine prices going up. There are medicine shortages in so many different countries. And I'm talking about countries without mentioning names that I never thought in my life I will see a shortage in, where I would walk into certain stores and I see shelves that are not stocked up or they stocked up in duplicates, so they make the shelf look full. I never thought I'd see that in my lifetime. I'll be honest with you, not in the West. Um, so you sort of take all this as a picture, and you cannot not be concerned. You have to be concerned. And at the very least, just have a contingency plan. It doesn't have to be your master plan, but just have a contingency plan, because we're entering a new era. The warfare of old, and I'm not a military expert, so I'm not going to pontificate, but I could say I've done my fair share of reading military history and whatnot. And we are at one of those inflection points in history where, just like in World War II, people were not aware that the battleship age is done. And these mega battleships, whether it's the Yamato or whether it's the Bismarck, their days are done just because of the advent of the torpedo, air-launched torpedo from an aircraft carrier. Changed warfare. And right now, between AI, quantum computing, and drone technology or robotics in general, plus subterranean warfare, cyber warfare, all of the sudden you have factors that can be implemented and utilized and leveraged by any state. You don't have to be a very rich country to have elaborate underground fortification. I mean, look at North Korea. North Korea has probably the worst economy in the world, but they have some of the most elaborate fortifications in the world. I think they have, in some publications I read, they have like 3 or 5,000 artillery bunkers pointing south. So think about the distance between the DMZ and Seoul. I mean, you could see Seoul from the DMZ. That's how close it is, right? So if you have 5,000 artillery pieces buried in bunkers, I mean,
And it's not difficult to imagine that these countries that have been isolated for so long have nothing to do but dig. There's nowhere to go.
exactly, because in a way, that's also how they get the population busy, right? To pay them something is they get them busy. So start digging. And that's why you will see these elaborate, I mean, if you look at North Korea, for example, they have these elaborate public works projects, right? I mean, just enormous public works projects. So you can imagine the amount of underground fortifications that they have. And the same thing applies to pretty much every other country. The only countries that are not taking this very seriously, unfortunately, is the West. Unfortunately, we're not taking this seriously enough. And I wish they would. I wish, like you said, there will be an awareness campaign where people are actually given blueprints, right? Where somebody like Ron could build 1,000, 10,000, a million of these and just, distribute them to people. And I think, I don't want to sound like an alarmist, but I think we're really at the precipice of big events, historical events. The advent of all these technologies, the scattering or the fragmentation of these technologies across non-state actors and small countries that are adopting them heavily is the ultimate asymmetric imbalance in warfare. It is the ultimate, because whenever you have a $2,000 drone requiring a $1 million missile to take it, you have a huge problem, because war is about economy. Economy is what drives war. Everybody knows that. Right. So, I mean, Hitler, there was a famous saying Hitler said when he knew that we were in the US producing a Liberty ship a week, he said, we already lost the war. Because Liberty ships were the ultimate workhorse for shipping grains, food, and supplies to Western Europe. So at that point, he knew at that rate, there's no way he's going to be able to defeat the Allies. And so the economy is paramount. And if your solutions, you're fighting, they always say generals are fighting the last war. These missiles were designed, these anti-aircraft missiles were designed to take down Soviet fighter jets, Soviet satellites. That's what they were designed. They were not designed to take down a $2,000, glued together drone that right now kids could put together. I mean, you have these hobby now you have these drone hobby clubs, right? And they have just incredible amount of technology that we couldn't even imagine 10 years ago, right? And we're just scratching the surface, let alone AI. I mean, Putin in the interview, he's talking about how AI is so important and so critical. In the US, the leadership is talking about also the dangers of AI. That's the genie out of the bottle. So the ultimate scary scenario is these asymmetric forces. The worst would be non-state actors that have these electronic warfare capabilities, and they're somewhere in a mountain 500 meters below ground. How are you going to solve that problem? That's the question that really, I'm surprised that at least we as normal people, not aware that anybody's taking seriously enough to put in the budget, the resources, the brains, and we have all that to try to find a solution, an asymmetric solution for this asymmetric problem. Because you cannot apply the same thing that happened in World War II. You can't apply the same thing that happened in Desert Storm. Those days are behind us. Conflict have changed, technology have changed, people have changed. And
Yeah, the
we
only potential saving grace here is that perhaps this stalemate that we're in terms of this subterranean conflict might forestall the countries from employing more aggressive methods, knowing that it's just going to be in an impasse at some point. So perhaps, this awareness of Bakhmut, there's a mixed blessing there, and Azovstal and Gaza, because it might slow people down in their ambitions, their imperialist ambitions on either side.
well, let
But
me let
we
me give you the
also might
reverse.
see we also
Yeah,
might see
yeah, the
an
reverse.
escalation. Yeah, the reverse,
Let's see
and
the
that
reverse.
the
And
only way now to go is utilizing non-conventional means. We have to use underground nukes. That's the only way we can get rid of these tunnel systems. So there's definitely a possibility of that.
well, listen, I mean, if you look, based on the topic of this conversation, if you look at the Battle of Iwo Jima, which happened in the Pacific on the island of Iwo Jima during the Pacific campaign of World War II, and then Pililao and I think Saipan. In Iwo Jima, we had 25,000 casualties just to take Iwo Jima, right? There were 10,000 casualties on Pelelayo in an area that was, I think, 400 meters by 600 meters to take it, which is the main Mount Suribachi in Iwo Jima. The number of casualties we lost over there was enormous. So a lot of people say that the main motivator or the main motivation behind using Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and I'm not justifying it at all, I'm just relaying historical debate based on research, that the military experts at the time said, hey, unless we want to lose 1.5 to 2 million people invading the mainland, we better do something. So there's a flip side, a dangerous side to what you're saying, which is instead of being a deterrent, actually it justifies that, hey, we have to go non-conventional because it's the only way that we could defeat this adversary. And that will open Pandora's box and it will never be closed again.
And it's interesting because in the movie Oppenheimer, they made a point of putting that into the public's unconscious. Because I'm not sure if you've seen the movie, but there's a scene where they're talking about that very thing. And they're saying, if we don't use this nuke, there's going to be X amount of casualties as a result of, combat that's going to take place on these island chains. So we have to use a nuke. So almost putting that into the minds of the public that, hey, this can save lives, right? Taking it to the unconventional level is actually more humane. So I agree with what you're saying. So there's, it could go either way, I suppose, but knowing our nature, it's going to go in the wrong way.
And that's what really makes it so disturbing, because once you put yourself in this type of position where you have to choose life and death between like huge amounts of people and you're trying to triage that is just such a scary scenario, to be honest with you. And I hope to God we don't have to face it. But in World War II, we faced it. And I'm not saying it's right or wrong. I wish there was another way that it could have been handled, but we're finding ourselves right at that crossroad again. And I hope that at least, I mean, MacArthur, for all what he did, there's a point I'd like to mention about that decision. MacArthur, to all his eccentricities, let's put it this way, and the decision to use the nuclear bomb, and he wanted to use it in Korea, by the way. If he wasn't fired, he was going to use it in Korea. That's documented historical fact. It was the main reason behind his relief of duty. But one thing he did that was extremely important, and it's funny because it's part of fortification and asymmetric warfare. It's called asymmetric cultural understanding. Let me explain what that means. When after Hiroshima and Nagasaki, when Japan conceded, the one thing that he did that was very smart in terms of asymmetric cultural move was that he allowed Japan to keep the symbolic, culturally important respect for the emperor and kept the emperor position. And there were a lot of people saying, no, 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 we gotta get rid of all that. We gotta start fresh. He said, no, no, no. This will work better with us because the emperor figure is very important in the Japanese culture, and I respect that. So they said we have to maintain that, and that will serve as the basis for building a better relationship in the future because we did not culturally wound the Japanese beyond repairs. So it was sort of again, I'm not saying it's right or wrong, I'm just stating what historically has happened. And right now, my biggest worry is in the absence of a solution that is conventional to these underground fortifications. I could totally see the battle cries being justifying because, and especially now we're so casualty averse nowadays. You know what I mean? There is the days of 25,000 Marines lost in a day or in a battle. I mean, those are it's just unimaginable right now, right? So, but the flip side to that is I wish they would put so much time, effort, and resources into trying to find conventional type of solution, like cyber warfare, for example, like robotics, like who knows, a new technology. There might be new technologies out there that we don't even know that's able to mitigate these risks without having to push us into, well, there's only one tool left in my toolbox and I got to use it. That's really what terrifies me and concerns me a lot is I wish they will, and I am positive we have enough brilliant minds out there that if they're given the time and if they're giving a Manhattan Project, right? The effort, Manhattan Project. I mean, you saw the movie Oppenheimer. I didn't, but I'm familiar with the Manhattan Project, where basically all hands on deck. Here's an unlimited budget. Go ahead, find us a solution that could potentially save humanity. I think it should be all hands on deck because any conventional solution, tech driven, is much better than the non conventional alternative, which could basically lead to the apocalypse. I mean, it's not an exaggeration. These terms, by the way, what's disturbing is since the beginning of the Russian conflict, I don't remember listening to the terms in the media or from politicians, World War III and apocalypse. Those words were off limits. I mean, nobody used them.
Yeah.
I don't remember anybody using them really, unless you want to go back to the days of Reagan and Gorbachev or Bush and Gorbachev. But
Yeah, within the
now,
last year, it's become firmly
normalized.
embedded in the zeitgeist
Yes,
and
yes,
the language that's being used, and now it's being weaponized in a way. So we have to be careful with it. But what's concerning to me with respect to the blending, perhaps, of non-conventional and subterranean, is the training that's currently being conducted. I'm not sure if you heard about this with Russian soldiers, where they're specifically training utilizing FOAB-like
yep,
bombs that are supposed to
yep,
simulate the effect of a
yep.
nuclear explosion, but specifically training for ground burst explosions. So ground burst explosions, just so people know, are utilized to target, missile silos, bunkers, because typically you want an air burst because that's how you're going to maximize your, blast radius and
Right.
kill the most amount of people. But if you're training for ground bursts, that almost means that they know that future warfare is going to involve the use of potentially like low yield tactical nukes to try to take out bunkers because perhaps they obviously they know more than we do about what countries are preparing for in terms of future warfare. So I can only imagine that maybe I hope that we have contingency plans for that, but just the fact that they're preparing for that very specific use of nuclear weapons is concerning. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, I do, and unfortunately, I think the concept of using tactical nukes for tactical, just the name is so deceptive. Tactical, right? Implying mini. Um, the problem is the your enemy gets to vote. That's in battle, in combat, the enemy has a vote. So while you think the use of a tactical mini, whatever miniaturization term you want to use, is okay from your side, you have to think of the domino effects, the hurricane that you're going to unleash in terms of a counterstrike or in terms of reaction, not just from your immediate adversary, but from the entire axis. So the whole concept is very dangerous because it's never been tested. That's the other thing. And now you're talking about other countries that have these resources. So unfortunately, it's becoming part of the literature. You're hearing it. You're hearing even some publications, some media say calling for it, and some so-called experts calling for it. And it's extremely alarming because once you open Pandora's box, you ain't never going to be able to close it. And it never works as planned. So it definitely is a big concern. And there's another thing that people are not thinking about. There's another big what if. In the Cu Chi tunnels in Vietnam, there were a lot of times where people went in, I mean, our forces went in and just blew up a tunnel, thinking that's it, we destroyed it. Not realizing they just destroyed a small part of it, and actually it took a few days and it was back in business again, right?
They destroyed like the decoy component of it, perhaps.
Decoy component or any of it, it's spread. Again, I go over the concept of dispersal and redundancy, right? The concept of dispersal and redundancy. So when you're talking about these Russian sites, for example, over 400 square miles, it's spread. What non-conventional weapon could take 400 square miles? I'm not aware of any, right? Let alone underground. So a strike might even give you the wrong information because you in your mind might think, oh, that's done. I took care of that one. But you didn't. So there's no way of doing battle assessment, battle damage assessment, right? So there are so many variables out there, and I don't understand why the rush to war. Why don't we all just take a step back and try to just calm things down? Because I think we're rushing into a situation where we don't know what the other party has. We don't know what's up their sleeve. We don't know what cards they're playing. And we're just going in using the same playbook. I don't care how good and talented a football team is. If you keep running the same play over and over and over, eventually, even a bad team is going to be able to stop it. And that's the part that concerns me is we're not dedicating enough resources for innovation. We're not dedicating enough resources for the cutting edge technologies that we need to be looking at to stop a conflict like this. Like imagine if they were able to invent some sort of a laser that could penetrate all these layers, for example. Hey, that could be a difference maker, right? But why are we not putting the resources in that? So there's a lot of problems right now that I think people, unfortunately, are not taking a good look at and are not paying attention to its implications because nowadays the world is so interconnected and a crisis in one country is not sanitized. You will have a cascading effect. If there's a problem in Japan, if let's say the Korean conflict erupts, okay, could anybody with any educated guess tell me what's going to happen to the Japanese stock market that day? And what's going to happen to the South Korean stock market that day, Chinese stock market that day, and what's the implications on the global financial system? I mean, that alone could have the effect of a nuke. So the situation is so interconnected and fragile that really a tipping point could be achieved from any multiple scenarios, and we've never had that before. I mean, even at the height of the Cold War, you really had two camps. Warsaw versus NATO. Okay, and that had a leader, that had a leader. Right now, you have a multipolar world, and now you have non-state actors with capabilities of more capabilities than some countries. But it seems like we have not revised our doctrines, we haven't revised our method of conducting policy or conducting, diplomacy.
It seems like they're perhaps starting to, but of course, a lot of this stuff is done under the radar. But I know that they're currently starting to experiment a lot with underground nuclear testing, and that is what the United States has done some non-nuclear underground nuclear tests recently, and allegedly so are the North Koreans, so are the Chinese. So there's this new emphasis on underground nuclear testing, which is concerning considering what we're talking about here today in ground burst detonation. So I do think that they're preparing to utilize nuclear weapons in this capacity like we're talking about here. I think if we just think about, the first ever nuclear test was conducted, I think it was last year, by the United States. Most people don't even know it. It wasn't an actual nuclear detonation, but I can't remember all the details of it, but they called it an underground nuclear test. So why you would do this underground, what exactly was learned from this research, and are they preparing to utilize it in this way, knowing full well that this is what they're going to have to contend with if they ever, have to go this route. There's so many dimensions of this, because perhaps we should be maybe talking a little bit more about what's likely the next big crisis, which is a war with Lebanon, which appears to be, judging by my watch, any day now. We know that the shit's going to hit the fan on the Rafah border today with Israel, and inevitably this is going to go back to Iran, who has vast underground military complexes. They have their nuclear stuff underground. I was reading a report by Al Jazeera that said that the U.S. bombs are unlikely to reach, like even the best bunker busters are unlikely to be able to penetrate these facilities. So we're put in a situation where it's probably very likely that Iran will get a nuclear capability. And, what is that going to mean for the region? Is it actually going to have a more positive effect in that maybe it's going to create a balance of power there that will prevent further escalation? Knowing anything with our leaders, seeing what they're doing with Moscow burning it down right now, I'm not, putting all my eggs in that basket. What do you think about how subterranean warfare is going to be leveraged in, I'll ask you two questions, a war with Lebanon and then a war with Iran?
Well, the wishful thinking is nothing, but the reality is everything. The conflict, the way, and I have a lot of experience traveling to the Middle East and, on business and whatnot. That region is a tinderbox. It's ready to go up in flame. The one thing that's, it's funny because you talk to some of the older Austrian professors about history and about World War One and the event that led to World War One with the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand, the heir to the Austrian Empire. And they all talk about how nobody up till that point suspected that there will be a world war. Everybody thought, especially considering that the King of England and the Tsar of Russia were first cousins, right? And they actually look almost identical. And if you read the correspondence between the two of them, it all started with "dear cousin." So it's like unimaginable that there will be a war, right? But there's such a thing that is a term that has become very popular after the Vietnam War, which is called mission creep. Is the domino effect, the snowball cascading effect. The conflict in the Middle East doesn't show a single sign of abating. There is not a single sign of abating, and there is not a single sign of any stabilizing strategy. Everybody's acting tactically. Everybody's acting reactively. And everybody, what happens, von Clausewitz used to say, he used to warn against engaging your adversary for a very long period of time because they will know your methods and they will they will develop countermeasures, right? And we've been in the Middle East now for at least a better part of 30 years, right? At that point, other countries have took note of what worked and what didn't work. And they have really made the concerted effort into three sectors, into three areas: underground fortification, electronic warfare, and robotics or drones. Those are three areas that they have pretty much, I would say, went all in. because that's the only thing they could afford. But at the same time, it's goddamn formidable. Excuse my language. So, uh, so right now, a conventional army, when you look at all the advancement, let's say with the IDF, conventional army, a tank, it's designed to take on another tank. It's not designed to go into urban warfare and take on. I mean, you could go back into the days of Stalingrad, and in Russian and in German, they used to call it Rattenkrieg, which means the war of the rats. The generals hated Stalingrad because they were built an army for maneuver warfare. That's what made the German army the German army. And then all of a sudden they were subjected to fighting between rubbles, between demolished buildings. And that's not what the Wehrmacht was designed for at all. And of course, it led to horrific results on both sides, right? I mean, just absolutely horrific. So we're finding ourselves in the same position where you have the right tools for the wrong job. And in the Middle East, I don't see a way, because all of a sudden you have more non-state actors than state actors. So you actually have center of powers like warlords or mini states popping up everywhere. So there is no solution that you could apply to calm the whole place down. And from a geopolitical point of view, unfortunately, I think based on our leadership's statements, I mean, I'm going by the leadership statements, it looks like war is unavoidable. I mean, just listen to Lindsey Graham, right? I mean, war is just unavoidable. And I don't see a way that this will work out for anybody. I honestly don't see a way that's good, because we're underestimating our adversary. We're overestimating our capabilities. We are not practicing smart diplomacy, tough diplomacy. I mean, I'm just
Do you
speaking.
think that this Gaza mission was, it almost seems like a training operation, like that they're preparing for a greater conflict at the expense of the Gazan people, obviously, to engage forces in subterranean? Like, what do you know about the Lebanese underground systems? Do you know anything about what's going on there?
Well, I mean, just whatever is available in OSINT. And I read the Vinograd report, which was the Israeli commission that was formed after the 2006 campaign, and basically identified basically it was a detailed report from A to Z in regards to what's happening there. To answer your question, what do I know? Nothing, zero about that. But what
Fair
I
enough.
could believe is in the Vinograd reports and some of the other publications that came thereafter, the short answer is there was no answer for the fortifications. I mean, just today, I believe it was on Twitter, or I forget the channels, that they were saying that Hezbollah launched 600 ATGM, anti-tank missiles. That's 3 times what was launched in the entire 2006 war.
Wow.
So, and the Israeli government, and I follow the Israeli media quite well, the experts there were talking about the fact that right now, these anti-tank missiles are being used as a sniper rifle, which is not what they were intended for. That's an asymmetric use. An anti-tank weapon is designed, well, to be an anti-tank weapon. But then all of a sudden, you're using it as a sniper rifle to take out individuals. That's a different way of doing things, an expensive way, but nonetheless, casualties. So the literature on the underground fortifications in Gaza and Lebanon is almost non-existent outside of what's in the Israeli media and the Israeli research. And there was a lot of research done, but none of it is based on, I mean, the only way to know there is when you're there, right? But they have not conquered that territory to be able to go and see. For example, when the Maginot Line separating Germany and France was defeated by the Germans, they went in there and they took photos and they were able to measure everything, and they saw everything. That did not happen, not in Gaza and not in Lebanon. So the situation there is very, very opaque.
Fog of war. Yeah.
It's so thick. And for me, as a guy who deals with risk assessment and threat analysis, is whenever you have that many variables, the smart place to sit it out.
Yeah.
You're walking into, you have no idea what you're walking into. and that's really just for a normal layman person like myself, it just seems crazy. It's like you're driving a car at 100 miles an hour and you have such thick fog, but you keep driving fast. It's like, okay, eventually going to hit something.
And really, all they have is, I mean, we don't know what they have in terms of their information gathering methods. I'm quite sure that a high value prize at this point in time is somebody who knows the layout of these facilities, and you would capture one of them, and then of course you would utilize torture methods to try to get information out of them with respect to what is going on there. I'm sure that's happened on both sides. And I'm not sure if you've seen. I watched a video the other day. I think I showed it on the channel, but it was showing a Iranian rocket being launched, but they clearly brought it out of this underground facility because it was just out in the desert, and there was this one access port that clearly they had wheeled this thing out of, fired off the rocket, and then took the thing back downstairs. So it's showing you that they're structuring their entire strategy around what we're talking about here today. And the only real way to break through that fog of war is human intelligence. And so there must be some very high value targets of capturing people alive, I would presume, in order to get information about these. Because if some of the information that was leaked is true about the Iranian intel grab from the Israelis, then I'm certain that there's something in the other direction as well. I think that's the only. Is this going to put a higher value on those POWs and capturing people in order to potentially give up information? I presume that would be the case.
Well, I mean, you bring up an extremely important point, and it opens up tons of questions because, for example, how is it that a small area as the size of Gaza, after 120 days of war, or give or take, where you have the most advanced ISR systems known to man, you have probably arguably the best and most experienced Air Force in the world at this point, if you measure it by experience and hours and whatnot. You have one of the best highly trained forces in the world. And in such a small geography that usually in military lingo, it's called fallen, because it's undefensible. You're completely surrounded. You have no access points to anywhere. And the geography is so small and limited. How is it? I mean, these are the questions that we're never going to find the answers for right now, but maybe 10, 20 years down the line, is how is it possible that these targets have not been neutralized? That's question number one. Question number two, in terms of scalability, if Gaza is such a challenge, how are you going to scale that to Lebanon, which everybody in Israel and Israeli media and Israeli retired generals say is significantly more complex and significantly more advanced, let alone how do you scale that to North Korea and Iran?
Mm-hmm.
So what I'm trying to say is in terms
Much
of
less Russia and China.
much, much, much less Russia and China. So when you sit down and you think about it, and again, we don't have all the answers. We're normal civilian people, but I wish there will be an expert that maybe one day you could bring that could answer some of these questions, because from a scalability point of view, if you're not able to do that in such limited geography, how are you going to be able to do it across an enormously different level of threat in terms of size, scale, capabilities? It's so weird that we're rushing into something that we have no idea about, and nobody is able to say with certainty. And that's one thing that the American Biden administration is doing very, very well, actually, I think, is asking one question: what's the strategy? They keep repeating that question: what's the strategy here? Because if it didn't work at such a small scale, what is it that's going to make you think it's going to work on a much bigger scale? It's a very, very valid question. And where are you going to go with this? So for me, I think if a conflict erupts in the Middle East, we're looking at potentially $300 oil. I mean, we're looking at just disruption for the supply chain. We're looking at the most unfortunate loss of life uh, on every side, and I just it just really sends shivers down my spine when I think about it, because from whatever little information we have based on OSINT, it's a problem that has no solution. There's nothing you could do about these fortifications underground. Nothing that is scalable. You might be able to do something about one particular location, one particular site, but you cannot generalize this across the board. So that and all the equipment we have is really designed to take on the Soviet Union, more or less. And that's the bulk of our doctrine. And I think, it's not me, but if you listen to McGregor, Ritter, Johnson, Larry Johnson, any of these guys, they're saying we're still fighting the integrated warfare doctrine of World War II, the German blitzkrieg type thing, integrated arms, which is wonderful when you're fighting a peer. But with these type of underground, I found a lot of research documents that were written back to 2000. There was actually a very interesting document that was a research document done by the Air Force. And the guy who wrote it is just absolutely brilliant. His name escapes me, but he was a lieutenant colonel. And he was saying that we are in desperate need, and this is the year 2000. He's saying we are in desperate need for solutions for underground fortification. And he went into great details about what happened in Vietnam and Korea, and how we still have not answered these questions, and our reliance on air power alone is not gonna make a difference to an asset that's 500-meter underground. So it was a wonderful piece of research, and unfortunately, till today, we don't have these answers. But to answer your question, my own gut feeling is, unfortunately, I think the Middle East is going toward mission creep, gradual escalation, till it reaches a critical mass where it becomes a full regional conflict. And once that happens, it will be almost impossible to predict what happens next, because you have China, Russia, Iran acting as an axis, and North Korea. So I mean that's enormous axis. There are a lot of questions, and this is why I go back to the same point. We have so many questions and variables. Why are we not taking time to try to mitigate those and then deal with this at a later point? Why are we rushing to deal with this right at this moment where we have more questions than answers? And it would have been comforting if somebody would get on TV and say, listen, the problem of ABC, we already figured out a solution for, and here's a proof of concept type thing. But that doesn't happen. And I could tell you that the Middle East, the asymmetric forces in the Middle East are so different than those that were of 30 years ago. And I just worry, man. I just really worry. After the financial crisis of 2008, I set a goal that I definitely need something that will offer protection in case of financial crisis or a social upheaval.
The best way to support this channel is to support yourself by gearing up at CanadianPreparedness.com, where you'll find high-quality survival gear at the best prices, no junk, and no gimmicks. Use discount code PREPPINGGEAR for 10% off. Don't forget, the strong survive, but the prepared thrive. Stay safe.